Hello, hello. How's everybody doing? Hello, hello. So we're live. Okay. Anybody out there? Kind of feels like, who's that David Bowie character? Major Tom, kind of sitting there staring at a black hole, wondering if anybody's there. So I guess while we're waiting on people to show up, what could I talk about? We're working on a dictionary update, like roughly 50 expert entries and 350-ish essentials entries. Hopefully it'll be done, I don't know, a month or so. Takes a while to do these things. The expert stuff's really interesting. I've been writing my PhD dissertation, so if I have to like analyze a character for my dissertation, then I'll also go ahead and make an expert entry for it, so I can put any interesting things. John just said that he feels like Major Tom on his end too, so yeah, if you're tuned in, I guess you're pretty hardcore, because this is we're getting a little more and more towards the abstract end of this thing. Yeah, I don't know. For me, it's very interesting. Hopefully, you guys think the same. Let's see. So let's wait a couple more minutes, and then we'll like get into the meat of it. Yeah, actually, let me grab my phone. So I can see if I get any messages while this thing's going. Okay. So why don't I just go ahead and I'll do basically a very quick review of the other three parts that we've done so far. And that way, if people are showing up that were listening to had listened to a previous part, then they're not gonna really need to hear the recap. This is for anybody that's just tuning in. So okay, so basically, yeah, here we go. So basically, we've had one video for each of these parts, and the original question asked was, how do we know what basically Middle Chinese, Old Chinese, or essentially any older version of Chinese, how do we know what it sounded like? And most of you will know that recording devices were only invented during the Han Dynasty, so pre-Han Dynasty we don't have any actual recordings. Yes, I'm joking, as if you couldn't tell, but yeah, there were no recording devices around, so how do we know when we say, hey, this character sounded this way, how do we know that we're not just making up some random stuff? And it turns out there's roughly 4 classes, and these are just something I came up with for this presentation, so it's not, these classes aren't necessarily, you know, you're not going to find a book with the 4 classes of information, but unless I write it. So anyway, the first type of data is explicit data, and that's data basically where somebody in an ancient text is saying this character sounds like that, but this character is spelled with these characters, or this character sounds like that character. And then we have what I'm calling first-hand data, and that's evidence from within Chinese. Oh, sorry, the explicit data, you have stuff like rhyme books, which is a book where you can look up a character and see what characters rhyme with it. They also give information about the initials. You have rhyme tables, which are quite late in history, but they give even more detailed information. You have sound glosses, which is what I was talking about a second ago. And then you have dictionaries like the 说文解字, where they'll actually say this part's the sound component. So you know that the sound component and the character itself have a sound relationship. And then I already described the other part. And then the first-hand evidence is stuff like tongjia, where you use a character for its sound and not for its meaning. You have jiajie, which is basically becomes permanent tongjia. You have xiesheng, which is the sound relation between a sound component and the characters that it is in. You have foreign names that were written in ancient Chinese texts, and so if we know the foreign language, then we know what that name sounded like or approximately sounded like. Some we know, pretty well what to sound like. For instance, if it's a Greek name like Alexandria. You have variant characters. They have different sound components a lot of times. So that'll show the sound connections between those. You have rhyming text. You have variants of text, loan words, dialect studies, and how characters in modern dialects. And I went over all that in the second video. And what all that data has in common is that it's first-hand data. So it's actual native speakers of the language at the time using a character in a way that gives us some clue about its sound, even though the person's not trying to specifically tell us that. We have second-hand data, or what I'm calling second-hand data, which is evidence that's external to Chinese. So it's loan words into Chinese from other languages, characters borrowed into other languages like Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese. They all use Chinese characters. So the sound of the characters when they go into these languages and the sound they're using now and the various historical dictionaries they may or may not have. And then also phonology of nearby languages. And all that stuff I went over last week. So this week we're going to go over analysis and logic. And that's, basically you're trying to take all of this data and then process it in a way which is where you can get the most information out and the most correct. The information is, well, I say correct. What I mean is, what are the processes we go by how do we go by processing this data in such a way that we can have some amount of certainty, even though it's not 100% certainty, but we have some amount of certainty that our analysis is correct. And so today I'm going to go over using reconstruction using the comparative method, making predictions based on reconstructions, knowing what is normal when it comes to like phonology and sound, or phonology and semantic and other relationships within languages. Knowledge of sound changes from other languages, because that kind of tells us what's reasonable. Understanding language phonology in general also tells us what's reasonable. Things like Occam's razor and explanatory power. So, no questions? Alright, well, I guess I'm just going to dive right on in here. Okay, so reconstruction using the comparative method. So basically, when you're engaging in, and I'm trying to explain this in a simple way, so I'm not, sometimes I might say things more simple than they actually are, but roughly still the idea is going to be the same. So comparative method is you have a notion that perhaps two languages are related. And so you use this method called comparative method to see if you can reconstruct a proto-language. In other words, you take these two languages, you go in and you try to find words that you think are etymologically related. And if you've been on the internet or Reddit or whatever, you'll know that, virtually everybody has an opinion about about which words are etymologically related and which ones aren't, or which ones may come from such a relationship, or which ones don't. And so how do we know, how do we know that some random internet user's etymology is wrong or right, and that, say some professor's is wrong or right? And how can we characterize the probability of those being right? And the answer basically has to do with being systematic about things. So it's one thing to take two words from two different languages and then say, oh look, these look like they could be phonetically similar, therefore they're related, and oh look, the meanings are also kind of related. But if we're just looking at one pair of words, that doesn't tell us basically anything. And the reason it doesn't tell us anything is that words can be, in fact, I've read that up to 5% of the basic vocabulary of two different languages could be similar due to complete random chance. And I mean, to give an example, like when I don't speak Korean, but I've kind of looked into it a few times, and I've listened to Korean like learning materials and such, and it struck me that the number 2, and I don't even remember how to say it correctly, but it's something like tur. But I mean, it kind of struck me as sounding pretty similar to English too, but these two words are not related at all. So the relation there is coincidence. And how do we know it's coincidence? Well, because there's the word for two in Korean goes back from before the time that English had any kind of contact with Korean, for one. For two, there's no systematic sound changes between these two languages. I mean, there are, if you look at Korean borrowings of English words in modern times, but we can pretty much show that those words were borrowed in modern times, and we're not, these are not words that are etymological connections between the two languages, in other words. So like, okay, so the first thing you do when you're trying to use a comparative method on two languages is you look for vocabulary that may be related. And you don't just want to use any vocabulary. For instance, take the English word computer. If you look at the word for computer in almost all European languages, I think except French, it's going to be computer. Like in Dutch they say computer, and in German they say, well, do this? I think they're computer. Yeah, I think French is actually ordinateur or something. But if you look at this word computer, computers were, I don't know if they were invented by English speakers. I mean, it really depends on, I mean, some people say that Michelangelo, was it either him or Galileo, invented some kind of computer. And it really depends on like how you define computer. But if you think of computer in like the way we think about it in modern terms, basically being an electronic device, has a CPU, has memory, has RAM, or storage like a disk, and has RAM, and it makes calculations on things, and it's done electronically and not mechanically. If you look at that as a computer, I don't know if English speakers invented it or they just were the first ones to make it popular or whatnot, but the word computer is what you call like a technology word. And a technology word doesn't have to be what we think of as technology. It could be anything from a new way to grow coffee, or a new type of food, or a new type of, well, that's actually probably more a cultural word. But cultural words you don't want to use for etymology. Technological words you don't want to use for etymology, like cart or whatever. Cart or vehicle or wheel, those would be technological words. And so why don't you want to use those words? Well, because it's very likely that those words get borrowed, right? So the word tea, for instance, you have basically tea, which some I don't know if this is true, but Taiwanese people say that it comes from de, which is the Minanhua way of saying tea. And then like you have like the English word chai, which comes from something similar to Chinese cha. So you have these different words for tea, but tea is something that started in one place and then got popularized and got exported to a bunch of different places. So when they export this new drink to some place, and obviously I'm talking about a long time ago, but when they exported this new drink, they didn't have a name for it, so they just used the name of the people that were selling the drink, right? So it's very easy for something that's particular to one culture to be exported with the same name or a very similar name to another culture. So that's why you don't want to use these kind of words, because it's very easy for them to be borrowed. Same for technology. Whoever invented the wheel had a name for it, and then other people started using it, assuming, you know, obviously I'm not talking about cases where two different cultures invented the wheel simultaneously or near, not simultaneously, but near in time, and they didn't communicate between the two, and they both just basically came up with the wheel because it's an, you know, I say obvious, it wasn't obvious back before it was invented, but yeah, so if your culture has a wheel and some other culture sees that wheel, like, man, that's a really good idea, and they ask you about it, and you tell them, they're going to probably use your word or some word very similar, like basically your word with their phonology. Okay, so these technological words and technological and cultural words you don't want to use. You also don't want to use words like you know, in English we say ruff ruff, you know, for a dog barking. Even though actually in other languages the way they say it, like they mimic the noise of a dog barking, could be very different sounding than English. There is an actual sound that both cultural groups are hearing. So because it's based on an actual sound in the world, then there's a much higher likelihood that these words are going to sound the same in the languages. So you don't want to use those words either. You want to end up using words that are really basic words like eat, sleep, drink, you know, pee, whatever humans do. Those very basic words that all humans need to use. Those words are hard to borrow between languages, and for obvious reasons, because all languages are going to have a word for eating. You know, all languages are going to have a word for sleeping, getting sick, getting well, like, because these are just things that humans, no matter where they are or what kind of society they have, they go through these things. So those are the words that if two languages have related sets of words that cover these very basic concepts, that means that there's a high likelihood that these two languages are related. Okay, so the first thing you do is you try to find your set of cognates, is what the technical term is cognate. So you find these lists of what you think might be cognates, and then you start looking for systematic sound shifts between these words, or, you know, more accurately, you're looking for, well, you are looking for sound shifts between, but basically you're trying to, your end goal here is to create a proto-language. So if I have two words down here, I'm trying to find another word that these two words can be derived from. So the words need to be related in meaning. They don't have to have the exact same meaning, but you need to have semantic shifts to where they converge into this proto-language. And then you also have to have similar phonetic patterns or phonological patterns that could also be both derived from this thing that this proto-language. So this is actually quite an art to this, because sometimes words that look exactly the same end up being not related at all. And I mean, we actually, so let me give you an example. So in English, we have this word sound, and it means a lot of different things. And it always bothered me as a kid, and this is before I even got into languages, but it always bothered me that the word sound meant this ephemeral thing that we hear. So once a sound comes by, we hear it and then it's gone, you know, unless we record it. But it also means something solid and reliable, like to be of sound mind and body. And then it also can mean the body of water between an island and a mainland. And then it can also mean to measure depth. And so you got to think to yourself, how could this one word mean such crazy different things? And the answer is, these are actually multiple different words that ended up converging onto the same pronunciation. So sound, meaning what you hear, comes from Latin, I think, sonos. And it's funny because sometimes, like I learned Dutch and German like many years ago, and sometimes I'll just be walking down the street, not even thinking about language or Dutch or German, and suddenly the connection between words that I've known for many years will come into my mind. And that's actually how I came across this thing with sound. And I was walking down the street, and I was somehow the idea of the English word sound meaning solid and reliable, I suddenly thought, oh man, I bet that's related to, and probably if you're an English speaker, you know the word Gesundheit. That's how we say it in English, Gesundheit, what you say after somebody sneezes. In German, you actually say it as something like Gesundheit, and in Dutch, they have the same word, Gezondheid. And the G at the beginning of the German and the G at the beginning of the Dutch, which is actually written the same, those are just grammatical particles. So if you get rid of those and you get rid of the heit at the end of it, you're left with a zont or zund in German. And so I thought, oh man, I bet you that's related to the English word sound, which means healthy. And so I went home and looked it up, and sure enough, that's the case. So the word for what you hear comes from Latin sonos. The word meaning healthy or strong or reliable comes from the Germanic root, which is something like zund or zont. And then the other two meanings actually are also different words, which I don't remember off the top of my head. But you can see, so why am I bringing this up? Because we have, in English, it's the exact same, what we would call the same word. Even if you look up in the dictionary, you might have sound with a 1 and sound with a 2. And that's actually indicating that these words have different origins. But if you're doing this kind of research and you don't already know this, you're doing it on languages that, you know, they don't have dictionaries, or they don't have dictionaries that point out these things, and you're trying to find these relationships, then you need to be aware that there are cases where so in English we have sound, they're pronounced exactly the same, but they actually have different origins. And so, and you know, then there's another question: is sonos from Latin and zund or zont from the Germanic languages, is that related further back in time? And I didn't actually look into that, so I don't know. But these are the kind of things you have to keep in mind when you're doing this. So things that look similar may or may not actually be related, and then things that look different may actually be related. And so let me highlight. Have you ever thought of, I'm pretty sure the answer is no, but have you ever thought of the fact that the English word for 5, French cinq, which is the same meaning, and Armenian hing, which is the same meaning, that these are actually etymologically related words? These aren't just 3 words that mean 5 that look different, but they actually are related. And last week, I think I showed you part of that paper I wrote for the conference, and this came up. So the pi here means Proto IndoEuropean, So basically, the theoretical ancestor of all Indo-European languages. You know, anyway, I'm not going to go into into pi, but basically the way pi was invented was different pairs of languages were compared, proto-languages that came up with for those pairs, and then they started comparing proto-languages, and then came up with various groups of proto-languages, and then came up with a language that was proto to all that stuff. So the Proto-Indo-European word for 5 is this thing here, which I guess is like, and I don't know actually anything about emphasis, which syllables are supposed to be emphasized in Proto-Indo-European, so forgive me if you know about this, or maybe you can tell me in the comments. It's pronounced something like Pengua. So in English, getting from Proto-Indo-European to English 5, you go through all these different stages, and you have Pengua, which becomes Penpa, and then that change right there, I'm pretty sure happens to the whole Germanic branch. And then, so Penpa becoming Pempa is a very normal sound change, and what's happening is that you have a nasal N, na, which is pronounced in the front of the mouth, and then you have pa pronounced with the lips, and what's happening is the nasal is changing the place of articulation from the front of the mouth to the lips. So it's matching the point of articulation, or the place where the P is said. So it's turning from N into M. And you'll notice actually that this change happens in a lot of languages. Okay, so then Pempa in Proto-Germanic becomes Fünf. And if you've ever learned German, you know that their version of 5 is Fünf. So that's pretty close to Fünf. In Dutch, it's actually closer to English, where it's Vijf. But that becomes in in Old English, it becomes, I guess that's Fief. I'm not really sure how that I is pronounced, Fief. And then 5 in English. So in the French, French goes back also to Pengua, which becomes Quinqua, and I'm pretty sure that P to K change there happens in all the Latin-based languages. So or maybe they call it Proto-Italic, I think, which is pre-Latin. So Pengua becomes Quinqua, and what's happening there is that's also an assimilation of sorts. It's the initials assimilating to the qua at the end of the word. So Quinqua, and in classical Latin it becomes, and I don't know how to pronounce Latin, so forgive me, but something like Quinque, which becomes, I don't know what that 6 is doing. That's probably from becomes, I don't know how to say that, maybe cinque, but anyway, it becomes cinq in French. And then going from Armenian, or Proto-Indo-European to Armenian, is Pengua to Hengua, which actually this is also fairly interesting. It's something I was going to talk about later, but so here you have the P, pa becoming ha, and so as I mentioned before, P or F actually in Mandarin comes from earlier pa or ba. And if you spend any time around Taiwanese people, you'll note that people that speak Taiyu or Minanhua, they have a hard time saying F sounds. So there's a thing that people say a lot to kind of mimic this accent. And so in standard Mandarin, you say 坐飞机喝咖啡. And when they're mimicking a person that's got a Minnan accent, they'll say 坐飞机喝咖啡. And I actually saw one on the news, which is it's pretty extreme, but this person said 房子 as 皇子, because they were talking about buying houses or something, and this person said 买皇子. So that's actually pretty interesting. So what I'm trying to tell you here is pa to fa is a very normal sound change. F to H is also a normal sound change. Okay, so you go from Pengua to Hengui to Hengu to Hing. Okay, so the point of this here too is that if you're an analyst and you're looking at 5 in Song, or you're looking at 5 in Hing, your first reaction to that's probably going to be they're not related. Now, if you know a whole lot about different sound changes, you might in your mind start thinking, well, you could go from here to here and then here to here. Like for instance, the F beginning, I would immediately think of the Taiwanese thing I just told you. Although I would think the F and the G were probably not related. So the point is, I just showed you 2 examples of one where things look like they're the same but aren't, and then things where they don't look the same but they actually are. They do have actually a common ancestor. And the key to this too, I just want to point out again, because whenever you think of are these words etymologically related, you want to think of are there systematic sound changes that I can show? Because, like for instance, going back to Pengua becoming Penpa, I can't just change that to Pengua to, you know, I'm just making something up here, but Pebpa, because I have a word that will make this work. It has to be systematic for the whole thing. That's not to say there are never exceptions, but exceptions need to be treated differently, and there's sunk. Okay, so Rafi's saying the I in sunk is like asked, sunk. Okay. Yeah, I studied French. I don't speak it, but I studied French, and it was a long, like 20-something years ago, and never got to the point where I could converse. So definitely give me some grace when it comes to my French pronunciation. But thanks for pointing out what it should sound like. Yeah, so anyway, this is all systematic stuff. So you can't like adjust your rules for each word that you're doing, right? Because if you do that, the thing's not systematic. And if it's a real etymological connection between 2 words, it's very likely that the sound shifts are systematic. And once again, I'm saying this more easily. This is a more simple version than reality, because there's other things going on where you have morphology, meaning, you know, grammatical particles or grammatical words, and the rule, and like which syllables being emphasized in which words, and there's a bunch of other stuff going on which I'm not talking about. I'm just trying to give a basic idea. Okay, so the next step in your reconstruction is you want to figure out what the systematic sound changes are between your groups of words, and then you reconstruct. Then you use that to try to reconstruct your proto-language. And once you have your proto-language, you want to look at it and say, hey, is this thing normal looking? I mean, does it look like human languages look, right? Because if you have you know, 300 vowels in your proto-language, then probably you're doing something wrong. If you have sounds in your sound inventory that explain your that can explain systematically how the proto-language derived to the real languages, but it contains sounds that human beings can't make, then you're probably doing something wrong. Or if you have, like, you know, 6 consonants in a row and then 3 vowels, that doesn't look normal either, right? And it's not to say that weird things don't happen, because they do happen, but it's kind of a check to say, hey, you know, if your language is looking, in linguistics you call it topologically weird. If your language is looking topologically weird, there might be a problem. It's something to look into. Okay, and then Yeah, so once you've come up with your proto language, then you might want to go back and try to refine the system. Like now that you're more familiar with which sound changes happened, you'll be able to find. In fact, actually, a sign that your proto language. When I say proto language, what I really mean is your set of sound shifts and semantic shifts. If you've done this right, you should be able to go out and find a bunch of more. You should be able to go find another set of words that you didn't recognize them before because of the systematic sound changes, but now that you're familiar with the sound changes, that you recognize some new words. You should be able to go out and find even more words that are related than you had in your initial set of words that you thought were related. Okay, so that's kind of how, a very simple explanation of how reconstructions work. But what gives us confidence in reconstruction, besides the stuff that I've mentioned in previous videos, is the fact that they're based on systematic sound changes, that you're not just ad hoc saying, okay, for this word the sound changes are these, for this word the sound changes are these, but you're actually doing this in a systematic way. Okay, and then like making predictions based upon what you're doing. And this is something that Baxter actually emphasizes a lot, is making predictions. So for him, the ones I've heard him talk about he'll say, well, this sound component has this reconstruction to it. So if this sound in this reconstruction should not mix with, say, a certain word, but if they do mix, then that means that they mixed after a certain time because of the sound change. The sounds change over time. So, well, it's like actually, so like sonos, right? Sonos and sound. The sonos or son. Anyway, I don't know the whole sound change between what version of Sonos came into English to become English sound, or the one that means what we hear. But obviously Sonos and say Zunt shouldn't match. So if they end up matching, it's going to be after some point in the future where these words end up sounding alike. And so Baxter will make predictions like that, saying, if you see this sound component mixing with this sound component, in other words, maybe you have a variant character that have these two different sound components, he'll say then that variant character should come after this point in history or before this point in history, depending on which direction you're looking at the change. So he'll make these kind of predictions, and then a lot of times the predictions hold, and if they don't hold, then that also is good because it shows you a place where you need to update your reconstruction, and maybe it's based on a wrong assumption or something like that. So last week I showed this feng, like wind. I showed that the Old Chinese was something like plum that became param in Korean. So if this happened with feng, then it probably happened with some other word. And then indeed, the word for bear in Old Chinese, once again, this C here means it was a consonant, but we don't know which one. And this here basically is something like grum. The G is like, it's not just a normal G, it's like a go or something. Grum. And the fact that he has the R inside bracket or parentheses, what that means is he's not sure. In other words, he's saying there's not enough evidence to know if there was an R here or not. Okay, now I would think based on the Korean that there's not an R. So you have this something like guam, which becomes, I don't know how to say this either, but Hyung or something in Middle Chinese. And as we talked about last week, this M goes to ang in Middle Chinese, but in Korean it's still m. And in Middle Korean this was kwam. So this is a very closely related sound to this. So the go and the ka are roughly same place of articulation. The w, which in this case, in the Old Chinese case, it's not actually that they said a w, it's that the I think it's called labialized. The go sound is labialized, so something like guo. It has to do with basically rounding your lips. But in Middle Chinese being quam, it still ends in an m. And the o here would be an easy change from under the influence of this w. But in modern Korean, it's kum for bear. So since this is a single syllable and doesn't have the R in the middle, like if we go back here, param, this R here tells us there was probably an R or an L in Old Chinese, whereas here, if these words are indeed related, then that means the Old Chinese probably did not have this R. Okay. So the next thing is knowing what is normal when it comes to phonologies of human languages. The example I was wanting to give here is, there's a question that comes up in Old Chinese as to when you look at Old Chinese, you have a bunch of entering tone syllables or characters representing these syllables that interact. And when you get to Middle Chinese, there's a lot of xiesheng, which exiting tone. I don't know. I think it's exiting tone in English. There's a lot of xiesheng, say sound components or tongjia or something like that, that interact with rusheng. So basically they noticed early on that there's a very tight connection somehow between Old Chinese rusheng and then Middle Chinese xiesheng. And there's been, over time there's been like several theories as to what's going on here. Why are these things connected? And if you don't remember, rusheng or entering tone means basically that you have a word ending in P, T, or K. So that's rusheng or entering tone. And then I don't think this is called exiting tone, but I'll just write this xiesheng. So xiesheng in Middle Chinese means, it doesn't actually mean this, but xiesheng in MC, in Middle Chinese, do not end in P, T, or K. And that's not the departing tone, okay. Yeah, I thought exiting sounded wrong. The xiesheng character or syllable in Middle Chinese does not end in P, T, or K. That's not the definition of it, but they don't end in P, T, or K. So why would all these words that don't end in P, T, K rhyme in Old Chinese with words that did end in P, T, K? One of the theories, I thought I wrote it out. Oh, I did, at the bottom. So one of these theories says that all syllables in Old Chinese are closed. And they posit that the OC syllables that become xiesheng in Middle Chinese ended in voiced versions of these rusheng endings. So the rusheng ending would be pa, ta, ka, and the ending in Old Chinese that match these the rusheng endings would be ba, da, ga. Okay. So what happened to these ba, da, ga? Well, they're voiced, and voiced sounds. It's much easier for a voiced sound to disappear than for an unvoiced sound to disappear. And so, like in English, this actually happens a lot in English. So in English, we say day. In German, they say Tag, and it's the same word etymologically. And in Dutch, actually, is in the middle of these. Dutch is dag, and that h is like I'm not sure what the English way to describe this stuff, but anyway, day, dag, and tak. And Dutch and German also has, like, we say enough in English. In Dutch they say genoeg, and German it's genug. And you can see both at the beginning of the word the G disappeared in English and at the end of the word. Although the spelling, we could still tell it used to be there because of the spelling GH, but the English word was originally, well, Old English is probably something like eunuch or something like that. But these G's disappeared in English, and they don't disappear, and even like handy in English equals handig in Dutch. Handig. So that's another place where the G disappears. So basically the people who propose this theory are basically saying that these voiced sounds were similar enough in Old Chinese that the two groups rhymed with each other, but that the voice endings basically fell away before Middle Chinese and became xiesheng. And then a more kind of modern, I don't know if modern is the right word, they're both modern, but a newer theory at any rate, which I'm just calling theory 2, has to do with a lot of different things actually. It has to do with tonal genesis. I'm not sure that tonogenesis. So this tonogenesis thing is basically saying an S. In Old Chinese, there was an S ending, and that this S ending, as it evolved into Middle Chinese, became what was in Middle Chinese called xiesheng. And it's based on a French scholar from the, I want to say the 40s and 50s is when he wrote this, but he basically was looking at some Vedic or Vietnamese and related languages, and he discovered that Vietnamese is actually related to some languages that aren't tonal, and that if you look at the etymologically related words in these two languages, that the tones of Vietnamese match certain endings in this other language. And so the tone in Vietnamese that matches xiesheng in Middle Chinese, in this other language they had an S as an ending. And then he also proposed a glottal stop ending based on the same kind of thing. The glottal stop ending was the basis or the genesis of xiesheng in Middle Chinese. So glottal stop being yeah. They did all here in England, like water instead of water, water. But anyway, so this tonal genesis or tonogenesis applied to Old Chinese solves yet another problem, and that is if I have a rusheng ending like K that ends up having an S at the end of it, it will evolve into just S. And the reason it does that is that the S assimilates the K. So in other words, the S, I mean, you can think of like an English, like, well, trucks. Like we say truck, but trucks. So the K in trucks is lighter than the K in truck. Trucks. Yeah, the K in trucks is more like the K, the way like say Cantonese speakers say K at the end of it, like truck, instead of truck. When you add the S there, trucks. Yeah, or maybe I'm deceiving myself. I don't know. I think that's right. At any rate, the K causes the S causes the K to be pronounced in the same part of the mouth as the S, which causes the K to disappear. And then by Middle Chinese, it becomes the entering tone. Okay, so the idea in here is that if a word like doc rhymed with a word like docs, then it's because of they both share this DAK sound. And so theory one of its biggest problems is there are no languages that have ever been observed that are all closed syllables. And in linguistics, there's an idea of things being marked. And if something's marked, what that basically means is it's not the normal thing. It's something that's, I mean, it doesn't mean it's abnormal per se. It just means it's not like if you talk about an unmarked sentence, like if I say, he's going out of town, right? That's the unmarked sentence. If I say, he's going out of town, I mean, that's not a weird sentence. It's not an unusual sentence, but it's marked, and it's marked in the sense that it's not just the generic way of saying that sentence. It doesn't just mean he's going out of town. It means he and not somebody else is going out of town. So that's the difference between marked and unmarked. So things that are unmarked tend to be more stable. They tend to not change as much. And I think we talked about last week that certain sounds that are really hard to learn, like even for native speakers, like English, in American English, the R sound is difficult. It takes kids until they're about 4 or 5 years old before they can master that sound, to whereas other sounds they master at, say, 2. So we would say, in this case, R is a marked sound because it's more difficult to learn. But the sounds in languages that are more difficult to learn are often not stable. And, their difficulty is the reason they're not stable. So let me get water here. Okay, so if we look at open syllables, and an open syllable just means a syllable that doesn't end in a consonant. So in Mandarin, basically, most syllables are open. The only ones that are not open in Mandarin are words that end in ung or un or ung. So man is not open, but ma is open. Ma is open. Ta is open. Hey is open. And so open syllables are much easier to say, and therefore they're less marked. And there are a lot of languages where you have basically all open syllables, and like Japanese is a language that's virtually, it's not entirely all open syllables, but it's mostly. Like, if I remember correctly, in Japanese you can only end with an N or a I think. Yeah, I think those are the only closed syllables in Japanese. And if you listen to Japanese versions of English words, like if you say like truck, they don't like consonants being next to each other without a vowel in between. So instead of chur, they'll say taraku, or something like that, taraku. But there's probably going to be a vowel in there, taraku. And they don't end in k, truck, so it'll become ku, taraku. So that's the case where a language is basically mostly open syllables. But there are no observed languages that are all closed syllables. And even the people that put this theory 1 forth, most of them will even say, yeah, well, there has to be some small amount of words in the language where that aren't closed. For instance, infants have a hard time saying closed syllables. And in fact, one of the reasons mother or mom or whatever, ma, is the word for mother or a word for mother in many languages around the world is because these closed lip syllables, toraku. Hey, you didn't put the pitch accent on there. But it's because for infants, it's very easy for them to go ma 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 ma. So they call their mother ma. I mean, I'm assuming a is easy to say as well. So for infants, they probably weren't saying like ma 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 instead of ma 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 ma. There's probably not a language that does that. I mean, maybe there is. But if there is, it's unusual. So theory 1. One of its biggest problems is that it proposes a topological, meaning, topology just means kind of like how normal phonologically or, grammatically this language is. It's proposing something that has never been observed in a human language. Now, logically, we can logically think, well, I mean, it's not logically impossible that a language would have only closed syllables, right? But at the same time, there's never been one observed. So if it did exist, it'd be very unusual. But theory 2, on the other hand, not only is it more topologically acceptable, in other words, it doesn't require making this language something that's never been observed in human languages before, it also provides a mechanism for the actual change. And the mechanism being the S assimilating the rusheng ending. So the theory 2 explain it. One, it has the advantage of not proposing something which is topologically very odd, like all closed syllables. 2, it explains the origin of the xiesheng, the departing tone, the thing that starts the departing tone, or the thing that the departing tone evolves from, also provides a mechanism for this connection between Middle Chinese rusheng and xiesheng syllables, namely the S ending, and that the S assimilates, which is also a normal phonological process, assimilates the rusheng ending. So when I'm looking at these two different theories, and this is something I was going to save till later, but I kind of have gone all over it already, but we have two theories that explain the same phenomena. One of them makes an appeal to a topological situation that's never been observed in the wild, so to speak, and the other one doesn't. So just on that basis alone, you would think the theory that doesn't appeal to this strange topological language is superior. But also, not only does it do that, but it also explains the origin of these tones, and it does it in a way which has been observed in other languages. And then it also, at the same time, explains this connection between the xiesheng and rusheng. So it has more explanatory power, in other words. So when we're comparing theories, these are things we want to keep in mind. How many phenomena does this theory explain versus how many does this one explain? When this one explains it, is it appealing to things that we've never observed before, or is it using things that are pretty normal within human languages, right? So, and none of these are a gotcha. I mean, it's the cumulative effect. When I look at theory 2 here, it explains several things, whereas theory 1 only explains basically 2 things. And it doesn't do it, and it does it in a way that requires pulling in this very strange topological configuration, being that this language has no open syllables. Okay, so these kinds of things are also things, because what are we trying to answer here? We're trying to answer, how do we know what older versions of Chinese sound like? So we know based upon data that I've already talked about, but then how we process this data. Are we processing the data in a way that ends up with something that looks quite natural, or are we processing it in a way that makes it look unnatural? Now, there's a danger here too, and so the danger being, it could be the case that Old Chinese is topologically weird. I mean, if you just think about it, topologically weird languages do actually happen, and it could be the case that Old Chinese was a language like that. So that if we press too hard with our normal criteria for this to be normal, we might actually be talking ourselves out of a reconstruction that accurately represents Old Chinese. So basically, we're talking about these in kind of in terms of probabilities. So there's a higher probability that Old Chinese would be normal versus being strange, right? Because by definition, the strange ones don't happen as often. Because if they did, they'd be normal, and the other ones would be strange. Okay, so moving on. Knowledge of sound changes of other languages. I think I've actually mentioned this already in an earlier video. But when somebody's proposing sound changes from Old Chinese to Middle Chinese, and they include a sound change which has never been observed anywhere except for in their reconstruction, you know, you can think, well, that's probably not true. That if they're appealing to sound changes that we know about, we can be confident that these are normal sound changes. And when I say normal, what I mean is, and I mentioned this too previously, is that the sounds a language can make are actually tied into human biology. And then sound changes are also tied into human biology. So, if you go back and if you look at Proto IndoEuropean, and you look at some of the earlier work done there, you have these things like Grimm's law and Berner's law, and these basically show sets of sound changes that happen a lot in European languages. And once again, these are laws, and they happen a lot in these European languages because they're tied into human biology. So it's not just some theoretical entity that they're proposing. They're actually have observed these sound changes. And it's like, for me, when I was first learning about Old Chinese phonology, Old Chinese L, or one of the types of Old Chinese L, turns into Y, the Middle Chinese, and that always bothered me, and I don't know why it bothered me, but I just, for some reason, just didn't buy it. And then I started learning some Korean and found out that actually happened in Korean, and they pronounce like my Chinese last name is Lee. It's this Lee. And they actually pronounce that as Yi in Korean. So once I saw that, oh, okay, I became very comfortable with this L to Y change because it's something that's already been observed. And like I already mentioned above, is this F going to H. That's something that, actually it happens between Chinese and Japanese. So you have words in Chinese that are pronounced with a like 100. It's pronounced with ba in Chinese, and it's pronounced with H in Japanese. And it probably went through an F stage at some point. And then also the opposite change happens. I was in Hong Kong and I met this woman from mainland China, and she was asking me if I knew any Americans that were looking to get married, because she was, and well, actually I kind of messed up the story, but she said, she asked me if I knew any other Americans. I asked her why she was asking me. She said, 我想跟美国人结婚. And I said, 什么叫做结婚? And she said, 结婚就是结婚啊. It's like, well, I actually knew that before you told me, but I still don't know what 结婚 is. And it turns out it was 结婚. So in wherever, I don't remember where she comes from, but her local language or whatever, they actually do the opposite of what they do in Minanhua. So for them, standard Mandarin H becomes F, right? Which kind of makes sense. So I guess we kind of were talking about this last week. So this would be a change, because somebody asked last week at the end of the thing about why do we still have stop consonants if sound change has been happening for 100,000 years? And I mean, the answer I gave at the time was it has to do with the fact that stop consonants, beyond being more difficult to say, well, it's a balance actually, because I was actually thinking about this after I got off the video of what would it be like if a language only had vowels, and I think it would be undoable, because I mean there's nothing to grab onto. You're like ooh ah yeah ooh ah ooh ah yeah ooh ah. I mean you need stop consonants in there for communication. But I guess what it'd be is that you don't want too many stop consonants either, because if you're like I'm throwing in some stops, but that wouldn't be easy either. So there's some happy medium in between those extremes. Okay. So understanding phonology in general is also a way. It's just kind of basically this is related to the same thing I just mentioned above. Is it has to do with the criteria of being quote unquote normal, and you know, when we understand how phonology works, like you're not gonna, unless you're creating a language like Klingon, which isn't supposed to be based on human biology, you're not gonna propose sounds for this language. If you're familiar with what sounds are available to the human mouth to say, you're not going to be proposing sounds that fall outside of that range, basically. Okay, so then we have like Occam's razor and explanatory power, and I kind of went over this already with that example of explaining how what was all Rusheng syllables in Old Chinese becoming Xiesheng and Rusheng in Middle Chinese. So, you know, Occam's razor, and you know, there's a million ways of saying Occam's razor, and you know, but basically in this context, what it means is if everything else is equal, if there's two theories that explain the phenomena, basically just say they explain it equally well, everything else is equal, but one of these theories is more simple, then that theory is probably correct. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but it's probably correct. And likewise, if everything else is equal and two theories that are equally complex, and say they have the same amount of, you know, they both, well, the one that explains with the least amount of ad hocness is probably correct. That's actually not what I was meant to say here. If two theories are equally complex, the one that explains the one that explains more phenomena is probably correct. So I have two theories. They both have a level of complexity, but theory A explains two phenomena, and theory B explains three without any extra complexity. Then theory B is probably the correct one. And once again, this is a probabilistic way of looking at things. It's not necessarily true, it's just probably true. And I actually finished. Wow. So I guess this would be a good time to ask some questions. Seems like there's a lot of interest in Taiyu. 家门本受的德为 So I guess I'll sit here and wait on some questions. my mouth is a bit, my throat's a bit drier this week. I'm not sure why, seeing how I haven't done anything much different from last week. Oh, wow. Is that what you guys are seeing? No. Okay, so I guess we could talk about how Old Chinese helps, like having understanding Old Chinese phonology. How does that help with like the research we do? Like, why do we need to know that as researchers? And you know, people have claimed, I've heard people say that we think that Chinese learners ought to learn Old Chinese. And also, another person said that we think people should learn bronze inscription forms of characters. I mean, that's amusing. I've never in my life thought that. It's not ever. I've never been like on the hey, should they learn Old Chinese? I mean, of course, you should not learn Old Chinese to learn Mandarin. Of course not. And of course, you do not need to know bronze inscriptions to know Mandarin. I mean, that would be the most. I don't know. It's like people that say you should learn Latin so that you can learn French better. I mean, even my opinion on that is I would only learn Latin first if I was planning on learning like 4 Romance language. In fact, I'm actually planning on trying that. To see if it would do any good. But I suspect the difficulty and time and effort of learning Latin would far outweigh any benefit knowing Latin would bring into learning French, if learning French was your goal. I think learning Latin would be useful if you want to learn like 4 or 5 Romance languages. Then learning Latin might be more beneficial. And even then, you probably wouldn't have to learn how to read and write Latin. You just learn some of the basic words and see how the sound changes go. But, you know, within, like for me, the reason I learned about Old Chinese phonology, because it was very easy to tell that you're not going to be able to figure out, so for me, yeah, it's about sound change within a sound series. So if you take a sound component of a Chinese character and you list out all the characters that contain that sound component, you'll find in a lot of cases that at first glance the sounds are completely random and don't make much sense. I mean, sometimes they make perfect sense, but there are characters like let's see, the characters like or sound components like chia, these two, where if you don't know anything about Old Chinese phonology, or you're not familiar with sound changes, those two, the sound series, they're going to look really ugly and really random. Once you know kind of what the normal amount of sound change is in a series, and you kind of understand which initials are related, and when I say related, I don't mean necessarily related by they're said in the same part of the mouth, because there's cases where the old Chinese there's cases where the initials appear to be unrelated in Mandarin if you base it on place of articulation, but they're actually, if you look at what they were in Old Chinese, and it makes sense. And I'm thinking of things like, and you guys have probably even heard me talk about this exact one before, but like the sound component g, where you have like lu and lo. Lao versus things like ke, ge, he. When you come across a situation like that, I mean, if you're looking at Mandarin, the initials aren't going to make sense because they don't match. I mean, the l is not in the same place of articulation as the k, k, h. But if you want to make sense of that, and you need to learn about Old Chinese phonology. And that's, in fact, like I said, the reason I even got into it was I wanted to go look at these very difficult sound series and be able to make sense of them. It's extremely interesting. And that's why I put a lot of, because it's kind of a pain, to be honest, to put this Old Chinese stuff into an expert entry, especially if there's a table, because there's a lot of effort that goes into making the table. But I do it anyway because there's a lot of really interesting things that you would never guess about Old Chinese based upon Mandarin. It also helps when you're doing like other forms of character. Like for instance, if I'm looking at different parts of a character, and I know, say, the pronunciation of these different parts in Mandarin, you can't always connect them because sometimes they're just really different in Old Chinese. And if you look up the Old Chinese for different character parts, man, it just becomes super clear. And an example of this, which I think I've actually given before as well, but I'm known for repeating myself, so I guess I'll just go ahead and do it. When I was doing the research on xiesheng to xue, this thing, which, well, I don't know how to type that in. I'm just going to have to copy it. Give me a second. So this thing in xue that looks like this, in Old Chinese, or in the Shang Dynasty, yeah, during the Shang Dynasty, the thing which looks like this in xiesheng to xue, I was looking at it and it could actually either be building or 6. And the ancient forms of these two characters are super similar. So similar, in fact, that some scholars have proposed they're the same character. But I was looking at like different paleographers and what they thought that thing was, and some of them thought it was building, and some of them thought it was 6. And so on a hunch, I looked up. Let's see, I'm gonna try to do this in real time, so forgive me if this takes a bit of time. But so I'm gonna look up the old Chinese for xiesheng to xue, for mian, and for liu. John's telling me I need a bigger font. Okay, so of course it's going to come with this little tiny font. So that's for this crook. Is the old Chinese. Well, I mean, I don't really have to look up mian because it's very different. And the way I'm saying this too, I'm kind of like downplaying how difficult this was at the time. So this is mian. So this mian is, I mean, pretty much not gonna match kruk in Old Chinese. I guess I go ahead and look it up. This is taking a long time to look stuff up. Just my hesitation. Well, there's not actually a. There's not actually a. Let me see if it's a sound component somewhere. There's not actually a reconstruction for it in Baxter's stuff. But anyway, I'd been struggling with this for days, looking at tons of forms of mian and tons of forms of liu, and then also comparing that to the forms in xue. And then I looked up this Old Chinese, and those are pretty. I mean, the K's are different. They're both K's. One of them's the one in jiajie with this funky backwards question mark looking symbol is something like krok. It's like this really like krok. Whereas this one's more like kruk. But I mean, that makes a very pretty sound component. The sounds are very similar. So I had been floating around in these ancient forms and just could not figure out what to make of it. And then I looked up this Old Chinese of it. I'm like, oh my god! I wrote Baxter to ask him what evidence he was basing this K on for 6, because I wanted to make sure he wasn't basing it on this character, because otherwise if that's the case, then we're in this circular reasoning thing. So I actually wrote him an email and asked him about this 6 and where this K comes from, like what evidence is he using to base this I wonder, it could be. Let me see if there's any obvious things. I'm looking at, well, actually, I can show you what I'm looking at. Oh, here we go. So I'm looking at sound series to see if there's anything obvious. Bot, put, keep. I mean, it could be that. I don't know. The point is, a lot of times when you're looking at paleographic forms and they don't make any sense, you look up the phonology and then things start to make sense. Or, I mean, even the reverse happens where you're looking at phonology and you come across something that doesn't make sense, and then you find out, oh, that's because there's a paleographic issue with this form. It's actually not the thing that it's like what we call an empty form in our dictionary. There are forms that, yeah, like the one I think off the top of my head. These, I can't remember which is which, but well, there should be this. See, Cantonese ends with a K. That's correct. So this should be a T, right? No, it's also a K. Anyway, there was a case where, or there's actually happens a lot, where you're looking at the phonology, two things doesn't seem to make sense, but then you find out one of the character forms actually has corruption in it, or there's something going on where this thing whose phonology shouldn't match this other thing. It's not even, like, say phonology for character A doesn't match phonology for B, but then you look it up and A is not really A, it's some other thing. I know that's not very easy to follow, but yeah. So, how about Grim and Vern? Okay, so we have a question. I didn't see the question. Did Chinese undergo changes along the lines of Grimm's or Verner's law? Okay. So the question is, did Chinese undergo changes along the lines of Grimm's law or Verner's law? And I need to look it up real quick. Man. Okay, so looking at Grimm's law, one of them is the change from aspirated B to P to F, and there's definitely been B. It's actually in Chinese, it's actually B with a glide, like bia and pia. Those become F in Mandarin, so that happened. And then there's like D to T. that happened. Yeah, D to T. So Middle Chinese has voiced, aspirated, and unaspirated. And some people think the voiced was aspirated, some people think it wasn't. But it's definitely true that a voiced D in Middle Chinese would become T in Mandarin. Same thing with voiced G would go to K in Mandarin. And in some cases, if that affects the tone, depending on what the tone originally was. So, I mean, the answer is either partially yes or like this like the H, actually the way people say H's in like dongxi is like this X, similar anyway, and that let's see what that originally comes from. Okay. So anyway, in that same series with 喝东西的喝, there are things. Well, I mean, it looks like it could be. I should probably show you what I'm talking about here, but I'll show you actually. Okay. I guess I'm using the Japanese font here. It's supposed to be just H, which it is. If you click on it, it'll show you H, but it's a Japanese font. Okay, so these brackets, and I think I've explained this in a previous video, but these brackets Baxter uses to indicate uncertainty. And what he's uncertain of, what he's saying here is this thing was either a pharyngealized G or it was something else that acted like a pharyngealized G in Old Chinese and has the same reflex in Middle Chinese. So if that thing actually was a G, then that would satisfy part of this G going to K, going to X, which is part of Grimm's law. So there are definitely some commonalities. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to do some kind of like, I'd have to do some systematic research to give a definite answer. But I mean, it's definitely true that at least parts of it parts of Grimm's law happen in Chinese. Now let me look at Werner's law. So one of the things from Werner's law is a pa going to fa. I don't know of any case of that happening, or a ta going to tha. Wait, I said pa going to fa and ta going to tha. I don't think that one happened. But then it has ka going to ha. That's really interesting because Cantonese speakers, when they speak Mandarin, they'll replace ha with a k. Like, instead of saying 我不会, they'll say 我不会. And S going to Z. Yeah, Werner's law I'm less sure about. but there are definitely parts of Grimm's Law. Definitely parts of Grimm's Law. I don't think as a whole that maybe all the sound changes happened. Although I'm not sure. Like I said, I have to do some systematic research. I don't really want to make some proclamation off the hip like that. Yeah. So let me check if we have any more questions. And if there are no more, I guess we'll. Okay, so I guess there aren't any more questions. So I guess we'll just go ahead and end it here today. So let me just kind of do a wrap up here. Let me kind of summarize what this whole. What is this? Okay. There we go. I'm gonna go back to. I mean, I've already like recovered the other parts. So I'm just gonna go over like so. Before this particular lesson, we went over explicit data, meaning somebody in an ancient text was trying to tell you how something sounded. We went over first-hand data, which is people in an ancient Chinese text using a character in a certain way that lets us know what it probably sounded like. Then we looked at, and the week after that, we looked at data external to Chinese, so things like foreign place names or person names being written in Chinese characters. And then today, we've gone over basically the analysis and logic aspect of it. So basically, what do we do with all that data that I mentioned before? We do the comparative method to try to reconstruct proto-languages. We try to do this in a way that we can make predictions based upon our reconstructions. We want to know what's normal. Does our reconstruction fit into, like, say, what's normal for human languages, as far as phonology and as far as semantics? Can we show systematic sound changes between two languages to kind of prove their genetic relationship? And understanding language phonology in general and applying Occam's razor to what we're doing. So as far as the reconstruction and the comparative method, our ability to use these techniques in, say, like other language, like European languages, they give us a high degree of confidence that they produce good results. And that gives us ideas on how do we know what Old Chinese sounded like and what Middle Chinese sounded like, which is the question we've been trying to answer in the series. Okay, so somebody made a comment about because in Cantonese, hui is just we. Why would they add a K? They're not adding the answer to that is they're not adding a K in Cantonese. They're adding it in Mandarin. And the reason they're adding a K in Mandarin is that they're trying to pronounce h. So they're trying to say hui, and they're not. It's difficult for them to make this h sound. So they end up saying k. And if you say h like h dongxi, k dongxi, those sounds are in the same part of the mouth. So it's not weird that they would do that. But they're not. I guess the short or maybe the longer answer, short answer. They're not trying to say Cantonese we. They're trying to say Mandarin hui, and then not doing it correctly. So, okay, so I believe that's a wrap, and it's been it's been fun. So if you guys have any more highly technical questions that need to be answered, I guess this is a good place to ask them. All right.